Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a world of velvet gowns, whispered names, and candlelit corridors, and the kinds of secrets that didn't just risk a broken heart, but a broken neck. This isn't your average royal history. Tonight it's about queens, not just crown-wearing, banquet-throwing queens, but the ones who sidestepped rules carved in stone, tiptoed around betrayal, and still managed to get exactly what they wanted. Sometimes in bed, sometimes in battle, and sometimes both. These are the women who didn't just wear the crown, they broke it in. Now, just a quick reality check. You probably won't survive this. And I don't mean because of the juicy drama, though let's be honest, it's decadent. I mean because surviving court life in the age of arranged marriages, poisonings, and politics disguised as dancing was practically impossible. Yet somehow these queens did it and got away with their clandestine flings. Some even thrived. Of course, not all love stories end with flowers and violins. Sometimes they end with exile, scandal, or a very sharp axe, but that's later. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Trust me, we've got a long night ahead. Also, drop your city and time in the comments. I want to know what corner of the world you're relaxing in as we unroll these stories. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. It starts like this. You're walking down a long stone corridor. The torches on the wall flicker, sending dancing shadows over a silk tapestry, showing a queen handing her knight a token. Maybe a ribbon, maybe a glance that said far more than 1,000 royal decrees. Love in a palace is like fire in a library. Dangerous, ill-advised, and yet so very inevitable. You've probably been taught that queens were either beautiful wives or wicked temptresses, Madonnas or Jezebels. But history, as it turns out, is written mostly by those who are neither in the bedroom nor the throne room. The truth is far more layered. Imagine a world where marriage is strategy, not affection, where being a woman in power is already a threat, where every move is scrutinized, whispered about, or written in court records by men who feared or envied you. Now, imagine falling in love anyway, or at least deciding to have some fun. Royal courts were filled with spies, scribes, and scandal-hungry nobles. That's what makes the stories you're about to hear so impressive. These weren't accidental romances, they were calculated risks. These women played chess with their bodies and their crowns. And in many cases, the world never found out or found out too late to stop them. Because when you're the queen, sometimes all it takes is a nod, a glance, and a well-placed chambermaid to look the other way. Tonight, we'll slink behind the silk veils of Cleopatra's boudoir, where the perfume is strong enough to cloud judgment and loyalty. We'll sneak through the hallowed halls of Versailles, where Maintenon might have snuck her lover past armed guards wrapped in a cloak. We'll gallop across frozen Swedish lakes with Queen Christina, dressed as a man, possibly in the company of a woman she loved. We'll hear echoes of laughter from Ottoman harems and catch a glimpse of ink-stained love letters hidden under mattresses. Each queen has her method, her mystery, her lover, or lovers. And don't expect this to be a morality play. This isn't about judging anyone. It's about understanding how power, desire, and danger swirl together like brandy in a royal goblet. Take Catherine the Great, for instance. The rumors say everything from horse-related nonsense to wild orgies. The truth? A fiercely intelligent woman who handpicked her lovers like a CEO, assembling a board of directors. Practical, sometimes ruthless, but never boring. One historical fact to chew on as we settle in. In many royal courts, queens were expected to be politically loyal, but emotional fidelity wasn't always demanded, at least not by those who truly understood how court games were played. Affairs could be tolerated if they didn't produce scandal or worse. Illegitimate heirs who could shake the lineage tree just enough to drop a few heads. But even then, some queens danced that tightrope. Some even flaunted it. Here's a fringe tidbit. Did you know that some royal lovers, especially male favorites or dubots, were given actual titles, land, and pensions simply for being pleasing companions? Yep. One day you're a low-born noble with a nice face. The next you're Duke of Flirtation and sipping wine in bed with the most powerful woman in Europe. Not a bad gig, honestly. Now, about scholarly debate, there's always a tug-of-war between historians who want hard proof and those who read between the lines. Letters can be forged. Diaries can be exaggerated, but behavior is harder to fake. When a queen starts spending every waking hour with a handsome courtier, makes him general of the army despite his terrible military record, and he's got a palace next to hers, let's just say the historians start sharpening their quills. But don't worry, you're not here for a textbook. You're here to feel the chill of a midnight rendezvous through stone corridors, to hear the silk rustle as a queen turns toward the wrong man and doesn't care, to smell the wax and perfume and scandal, to watch power and passion collide in ways that were dangerous, brilliant, and sometimes genuinely romantic. So, settle in, because from here on out, every queen you meet will teach you something new about what it means to love dangerously and rule anyway. You're standing at the edge of the Nile, the sky stretched out in bruised gold and violet, the kind of twilight that makes everything feel like it's about to change. You turn, and there she is, Cleopatra, 27, draped in linen so fine it might as well be smoke, eyes lined in coal that dares you to look away. You don't. No one ever does. She isn't just a queen, she is Egypt. And soon she'll have Rome wrapped around her finger. First Caesar, then Antony. But this is where it all starts. Let's be honest, Cleopatra wasn't just playing the game. She was inventing new rules, new pieces, new ways to win. She's 21 when she meets Julius Caesar. Rome thinks she's a puppet. Egypt thinks she's too bold. But Cleopatra thinks it's time to survive. And survival, in her case, means seduction, not just in the boudoir, though certainly that was part of it. No, her seduction was political, intellectual, theatrical. She understood image, drama, mythology. She literally sailed down the Nile pretending to be the goddess Isis. Because when you're trying to win over the most powerful man in the world, why not show up as a living deity? You sneak through the palace corridors, trailing behind her as she arranges to be smuggled into Caesar's chambers rolled up in a rug. Is it cliché? Yes. Is it brilliant? Also yes. That one moment, risky, theatrical, and undeniably flirtatious, becomes the opening move in a liaison that shifts the entire balance of power in the ancient Mediterranean. Caesar falls for her, or at least falls for the image of her, intelligent, ambitious, exotic, politically savvy. She gets him to restore her throne, eliminate her rivals, and grant her legitimacy that Egypt alone couldn't. Historical fact, Cleopatra didn't just charm Caesar with her looks. She was multilingual, educated, and deeply skilled in statecraft. She spoke at least 7 languages and was the first of her dynasty to actually speak Egyptian. When she debated philosophy with Caesar's scholars, they weren't sure if they were in love with her or just wildly intimidated. Possibly both. Of course, Caesar doesn't last. Assassinated on the Senate floor, stabbed by men who feared he was becoming a king, which, to be fair, was kind of the vibe, Cleopatra flees back to Alexandria, her heart intact, power consolidated. She'd had a child with him, Caesarion, and that gave her leverage, but it also made her dangerous. Rome didn't like foreign queens with Roman bloodlines. Bad for morale. Worse for politics. Fast forward a few years. You're at sea, the salt wind tugging at your cloak. And across the deck you spot him, Mark Antony. If Caesar was cold calculation, Antony is pure heat, brash, impulsive, and wildly charming. A soldier's general, but not exactly a politician's dream. Cleopatra meets him on a royal barge so decadent it makes Versailles look like a cheap motel. The sails are purple, the hull silver, musicians playing as flower petals rain from above. Cleopatra appears again as Isis. Antony, to no one's surprise, loses his entire mind. Their love affair becomes legendary, half political alliance, half lust-fueled fever dream. They drink, hunt, debate. She funds his military campaigns. He gives her more territory. They play at being gods, literally forming a cult of Dionysus and Isis. And for a while it works. Egypt is rich again. Rome is nervous. Octavian, Caesar's heir, starts spreading rumors that Antony is bewitched, enslaved, no longer Roman. Fringe fact incoming. There are claims Antony and Cleopatra founded a club called the Inimitable Livers dedicated entirely to eating, drinking, and pushing sensual boundaries. Think dinner parties with peacock tongues and wine-soaked carpets. Probably not the healthiest governance model, but undeniably stylish. But here's the thing. Was it love or just strategy wrapped in passion? Scholars still argue about it. Some say Cleopatra saw Antony as a tool, just as she did Caesar, a way to protect Egypt's sovereignty. Others believe the affection was real, if ill-fated. They spent nearly a decade together, had 3 children, and seemed, by every account, to be entwined in ways neither fully controlled. But could Cleopatra ever really love? Or did she just understand that survival for a woman in her position meant making men fall for her? You're with her in her final days, the walls closing in as Octavian's forces breach Alexandria. She locks herself in a mausoleum with her handmaidens, sends a message to Antony claiming she's already dead. Whether by accident or design, Antony stabs himself in despair. The tragedy feels Shakespearean, but the real moment is quieter. Cleopatra, dressed in her finest robes, her hair and makeup done to perfection, takes her own life, or so the story goes, with a venomous isp pressed to her skin. There's debate about that, too. Snakebite, poison, a dagger, no one knows. Octavian, now Augustus, arrives too late. Cleopatra is already a legend. But what matters isn't how she died. It's that for nearly 2 decades, Cleopatra defied the expectations of her gender, her culture, and 2 of the greatest empires in history. She took lovers, bore royal children, and refused to be a pawn. And somehow, even when the Roman historians try to smear her as a harlot queen, she still comes through as powerful, intelligent, and unforgettable. You step back from the stone sarcophagus, the scent of lotus and blood lingering in the air. You've just witnessed a love that was dangerous, opulent, possibly doomed from the start, but it changed the world. And Cleopatra, she got away with it for a while. That's more than most could say. You're galloping across the green hills of medieval Aquitaine, the air smelling like lavender, sweat, and a hint of defiance. You grip the reins tighter, your eyes scanning the horizon. Somewhere behind you, a tournament blares its trumpets, knights crashing into each other with the drama of overpaid actors. But you're not watching the joust. You're watching her. Eleanor, 17 years old, already the Duchess of Aquitaine, the richest heiress in Europe, and not even pretending to care what anyone thinks. She's too busy writing the first chapter of a life that's going to outshine most legends. Eleanor of Aquitaine doesn't just take lovers, she collects power. And for a girl born in the 12th century, that's like walking barefoot across a minefield with a smirk. Her first husband is Louis VII of France. She's barely out of childhood when she's married off to him, dragged into a court full of bishops and piety, and told to behave like a saint. Eleanor doesn't do saints. She does poetry, courtly love, and men who understand the value of flirtation as diplomacy. Historical fact: Eleanor was a major patron of troubadours, those wandering lyricists who sang about longing, beauty, and scandal. She practically invented the idea of courtly love as a cultural movement. Her court at Poitiers becomes the hot spot for everything romantic and provocative. You can almost hear the lute music in the background and the awkward love poems being whispered behind curtains. Eleanor isn't just encouraging it. She's the lead vocalist in the soundtrack of medieval romance. Louis, bless him, is entirely outmatched. He's pious, dull, and more interested in monastic reform than his dazzling wife. Their marriage is a mess. Even the church steps in to try to patch things up, but it doesn't help that Eleanor insists on joining him for the Second Crusade. You'd think a queen showing up on a holy war would be considered bold, maybe inspiring. Nope, it causes a political meltdown. She rides at the head of her troops dressed in armor. Rumors swirl. Some say she bathed naked with her ladies in the sea. Others whisper about an affair with her uncle, Raymond of Antioch. That's your fringe fact tonight. While no one can confirm a tryst, letters from the time hint at undue familiarity. And when Louis drags her away from Antioch, he reportedly has to physically separate them. Eleanor, for her part, refuses to be silent. She tells him she wants an annulment. She's tired of being married to a monk. And here's where it gets even better. The marriage is annulled on grounds of consanguinity. Basically, we're too related, which hilariously was a common excuse when royalty got bored of each other. Eleanor is now a free woman. Well, sort of. She's also the most eligible, richest, and independent woman in Europe, which means danger. She gets kidnapped twice on her journey back to Aquitaine by men trying to force her into marriage. You hide in the crowd as she outwits them both, eventually reaching safety and making her own choice. She marries Henry Plantagenet, who will soon become Henry II of England. And this is not a fairy tale. This is Game of Thrones with better tapestries. The passion between them burns hot. So hot, they reportedly can't keep their hands off each other in public. They have 8 children, including 2 future kings, and for a time, Eleanor seems content. But Henry, unlike Louis, isn't intimidated. He's controlling, ambitious, and not the kind of man to tolerate a wife with political opinions, or any opinions, really. Which brings us to the lovers. Now, no one's entirely sure who Eleanor took to her bed after Henry's affection shifted to his mistress, Rosamund Clifford. Some suggest Eleanor had affairs during her earlier years, possibly even before her marriage to Henry. Others think her real romance was political, with her sons in open rebellion against their father. But here's the scholarly debate. Was Eleanor involved with a nobleman during her long imprisonment? Yes, imprisonment. After supporting her sons in revolt, Henry locks her up for 16 years. She's kept under house arrest in various castles, her communication restricted. Yet even then, she manages to pull strings. When Henry dies, Eleanor is released, and suddenly she's queen mother, regent, matchmaker to Europe. She arranges marriages, negotiates treaties, and advises her favorite son, Richard the Lionheart, like she never missed a beat. There's a persistent rumor that she was involved with one of Richard's knights, a young man named William Marshall, sometimes mentioned, a dashing, brilliant figure who later becomes legendary in his own right. No proof, no love letters, but plenty of opportunity. And Eleanor, she never needed permission to rewrite her own story. You walk beside her now in her later years as she crosses the Alps in winter in her 70s to secure a bride for her grandson. Still regal, still commanding, still untouchable. Her eyes are sharp, her voice low but firm. She's lost lovers, kings, sons, battles, but never her sense of self. That's the real legacy. Whether she took secret lovers or simply kept the court in a state of romantic tension, Eleanor knew exactly how to wield her presence like a blade. In the end, you sit beside her tomb at Fontevraud Abbey, where she lies carved in stone next to Henry, the man who both desired and imprisoned her. But her hands are holding a book, not his, a final flex, a woman of intellect, autonomy, and just enough mystery to keep the historians arguing for centuries. She got away with it, every part of it. You're standing in a cold stone chamber in a London tower, the fire crackling low. And you can hear it, the murmured plodding, the sharp shuffle of armor, the unmistakable tension of a queen doing something queens are never supposed to do. Behind the heavy oak door, Isabella of France is adjusting her veil. She doesn't look scared. She looks focused. There's ink on her fingers, wax dripping onto a folded letter, and the faintest scent of sandalwood in the air. Tonight she sends word to her lover, not a courtier or poet, but a commander, a rebel, a man who by every royal rule should have been her executioner. But that's the thing about Isabella. She always chooses the most dangerous path, and she never walks it alone. They call her the she-wolf of France. It's not a compliment, but it is accurate, if what you mean is a woman who refuses to be caged. Born a French princess and married to King Edward II of England, Isabella arrives at court with every intention of playing the part. Beautiful, well-mannered, and devastatingly clever. But almost immediately, it's clear she's entered a kingdom already occupied by her husband's favorites, most notably one Piers Gaveston. Edward, Doesn't even try to hide it. Piers wears royal clothes, sits beside the king at feasts, and acts like he married Edward himself. Isabella is sidelined politically and emotionally. And in medieval England, that's not just humiliating, it's dangerous. A queen without influence is a queen with a target on her back. Historical fact: Edward II's affection for his male favorites wasn't subtle. He appointed them to high positions, showered them with gifts, and openly preferred their company to that of his wife or nobles. It caused riots, rebellions, and eventually assassination. Gaveston is beheaded by angry lords, and Edward predictably spirals. Isabella, though, she waits. She learns. She watches her husband replace Gaveston with another favorite, Hugh Despenser, a man so corrupt and power-hungry he makes the last guy look like a charming inconvenience. You walk beside Isabella as she's pushed further into the background, her land seized, her allies banished. But behind that elegant expression is a hurricane. She doesn't sulk. She plans. And when Edward sends her to France on a diplomatic mission, he thinks he's finally rid of her. Instead, Isabella finds her way to Roger Mortimer, a nobleman, rebel, and former prisoner who escaped the Tower of London, literally, and fled to France. He's bold, charismatic, and he hates Hugh Despenser almost as much as she does. That's where the speculation begins. Did Isabella and Mortimer become lovers in exile? Most historians say yes. The timing is almost too perfect. Isabella's confidence explodes. Her letters become more aggressive. And when she returns to England, it's not quietly. She brings an army, literally, a queen-turned-invader. And Mortimer is right beside her, leading troops like a knight in a steamy political fanfiction. Fringe fact: some accounts claim Isabella wore armor during the campaign. While there's no hard proof she fought, her leadership was undeniable. She wasn't just following Mortimer. She was the face of the rebellion. The English people, sick of Edward's misrule and Despenser's cruelty, greeted her as a hero. Edward flees. Despenser is captured, tortured, and executed in ways you probably don't want described before bed. Isabella seizes control. And just like that, she becomes regent for her teenage son, Edward III. She's ruling England, sharing power with Mortimer, living openly with him in court, and no one can stop her. Well, for a while. This is where the scholarly debate turns sharp. Was Isabella truly in love with Mortimer, or was he a necessary partner in crime? Some think he was her equal, her partner in rebellion. Others say he controlled her, that she traded one master for another. But you can't deny this. She chose him. She risked everything, her crown, her life, her child's future, to align with him. That wasn't desperation. That was agency. For 3 years, they ruled together, not just as regents, but as de facto monarchs. Mortimer grows bolder, more arrogant. He styles himself like a king. Isabella, now in her mid-30s, enjoys the power she was denied for decades. But her son is growing up. Edward III isn't content to be a puppet. At just 17, he pulls off a palace coup. Mortimer is captured and hanged. Isabella is spared because she's his mother, but her political life is over. You find her years later in quiet retirement in a castle surrounded by books, gardens, and tapestries. She lives out her days with dignity, occasionally receiving her grandchildren. No more rebellion, no more war councils, just soft breezes through stone archways and a lifetime of mystery. There's something melancholy about her ending, but also something triumphant. She may have lost her power, her lover, and her grip on the crown, but she never lost her story. She wasn't a victim. She was a woman who dared to take what she wanted and rewrite the script. Yes, the church whispered. The nobles grumbled. But in the end, Isabella took a lover, toppled a king, and lived to tell the tale. You leave her chamber quietly, passing a dusty portrait where her eyes seem to follow you. Intense, calculating, still wild. She-wolf, maybe, or maybe just a woman who refused to be caged. You're walking through a battlefield, not one of swords and shields, but of whispers, papers, and thrones shifting beneath trembling feet. The ground is soft with mud and tension. Horses snort nearby, restless in the fog. And in the middle of it all is Queen Margaret of Anjou, hair swept back beneath a jeweled circlet, eyes locked on the horizon like she already knows it's going to get worse before it gets better. Her husband, Henry VI, is technically king, but he's more ghost than monarch. And Margaret, she's not just filling the power vacuum. She's owning it completely, and possibly not alone. You follow her into court, where the ceiling soars and the air is thick with nervous courtiers. King Henry sits beside her, pale, vague, and muttering prayers. He's barely functional, suffering from catatonic episodes that leave him unresponsive for months at a time. In those long silences, Margaret becomes more than queen consort. She becomes ruler, strategist, and if the rumors are to be believed, mistress to the most convenient man in the room. His name is Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, tall, noble, and very available. He's often at Margaret's side, speaking for her when she defers, advising her in private, and taking on a leadership role that looks, frankly, more romantic than it should. The court doesn't miss it, and neither do you. Historical fact: Margaret's relationship with Somerset raised enough eyebrows that when she gave birth to her son, Edward of Westminster, the gossip hit like wildfire. Whispers swept through the realm. Is the child even the king's? Henry hadn't been coherent in months when Margaret conceived, a fact that would be awkward in any marriage, but in the context of royal succession, that's downright nuclear. The fringe detail: Margaret reportedly fought anyone, noble, bishop, or rebel, who dared question her son's legitimacy. She'd appear in full armor beside her boy, raise her sword, and swear he was the true heir. Motherhood, in her case, wasn't gentle. It was warlike, fierce, loud. Though if there was an affair, she buried it beneath blood and loyalty. And yet, the scholarly debate around Edward's paternity is still alive centuries later. Some historians argue there's no way the child could have been Henry's, pointing to the king's mental collapse and the suspicious timing. Others believe the gossip was a political weapon spread by the Yorkist faction to undermine the Lancastrian claim to the throne. After all, nothing discredits a queen faster than accusing her of adultery, especially with a conveniently hated nobleman. You ride with Margaret now, her cloak billowing behind her, her son tucked safely in the wagon. It's the Wars of the Roses, and she's not just along for the ride. She's driving the cart through hell. Henry is basically a living banner, rolled out when convenient. Margaret leads the armies. She negotiates with foreign powers. She raises funds, recruits soldiers, commands respect. She does everything a king should do and still gets none of the credit. But if you look closely, it's not just her public strength that keeps her going. There's something else, something private. Somerset dies early in the war, leaving Margaret isolated. You notice how even after his death, she visits the places they once met in secret. You catch her fingers tracing the edges of an old letter when she thinks no one's looking. Was it love? Was it necessity? Was it both? There's a part of you that wants to believe she found solace in Somerset, that amid the chaos, she had someone to hold, to trust. But there's also the colder possibility that it was calculated, a strategic alliance disguised as affection. Margaret had no room for softness. Everything in her life was a transaction, even love. The tragedy unfolds slowly. Her son grows into a warrior, angry and passionate, traits that seem far more Beaufort than Lancaster. He dies at the Battle of Tewkesbury, cut down in the mud before he ever wears a crown. Margaret is captured, imprisoned, then ransomed back to France, where she lives in quiet disgrace, alone and forgotten. You find her at twilight, sitting in a crumbling manor in Anjou. The gardens are overgrown, her gown faded to gray. She doesn't speak of the war, or the throne, or the son she lost, but her eyes still burn with the memory of what she almost held on to. For a woman accused of starting one of England's bloodiest conflicts, she dies strangely quietly. No final monologue, no royal retribution, just stillness. Here's the kicker. Despite the accusations, the gossip, and the chaos, Margaret never confessed. Not once, not to her enemies, not to her allies. She carried the scandal to the grave, untouched and unresolved. And maybe that's the best kind of power, making the world wonder forever what really happened behind those stone castle walls. You step back from the edge of her story, heart heavy, mind racing. Margaret may not have worn a lover's ring openly. She may never have carved hearts into castle walls or signed letters with excess and longing. But she took what she needed when she needed it, power, loyalty, perhaps love, and she got away with it. At least until the world she built crumbled in a civil war. But even in ruin, she remains the woman who fought a kingdom for her son, who may have defied a king for a man who made her feel alive, who never said sorry. You're padding softly through a palace where the walls whisper in French and Russian, but the heart of it all beats with crisp, strategic Russian. You turn a corner, and there she is, Empress Catherine the Great of Russia, reclining with the confidence of someone who knows the world bends toward her, even if it tries to resist. There's a crystal decanter half full of sweet Tokay wine, her lap dog asleep in the crook of her elbow, and beside her stand a young officer, tall, polished, and absolutely not her husband, which is fine. She left that whole husband thing behind before the first thunderclap of her reign. Tonight, the topic isn't about thrones or treaties. It's about favorites, lovers, the velvet thread that wove through her decades in power and never quite unraveled. They always called them favorites, as if these men were mere baubles, a cute rotation of decorative young things. But for Catherine, her lovers were never just warm bodies. They were tools, yes, gifts to herself, definitely, but they were also partners in power, protectors of her person, and more often than not, men she adored until she didn't. Historical fact, Catherine the Great ruled Russia for 34 years, and during that time, she took at least a dozen known lovers. Some stayed for months, others lasted years, and every one of them was vetted personally. She didn't just swipe right on noblemen. She interviewed them, observed them, occasionally even let her most trusted confidant, Countess Bruce, test them first. No joke, it was like running an audition for the role of Empress's companion with a performance review system and a severance package that included land, titles, and enough money to retire in style. You walk with her now through her winter palace, past hallways lined with oil portraits and velvet tapestries. Behind each door is a story. Grigory Orlov, for example, wasn't just a lover. He helped her overthrow her husband, Peter III. Yes, the Peter who mysteriously died shortly after being deposed. No one asked too many questions. And Catherine, she married the empire instead. Orlov was rewarded handsomely until his usefulness faded and his instability grew. Then came Grigory Potemkin, the man who may or may not have been her secret husband. Ah yes, here's the scholarly debate. Did Catherine secretly marry Potemkin? Some historians think so. They exchanged rings, spent years as confidants and lovers, and though their romantic relationship cooled, their political partnership only deepened. He built her cities, commanded her armies, flirted with her rivals. Your fringe fact, Catherine had a literal love apartment built inside the palace, a set of rooms lavishly decorated where her current favorite could live discreetly close to her. It was like having an on-call boyfriend suite with room service and an imperial seal. Not everyone knew who the current occupant was, but the court always guessed. They kept score like it was a sport. Still, Catherine wasn't delusional about any of it. She knew these men loved her power more than her. She just didn't care. Love for her wasn't about naivety. It was about exchange. You give her affection, loyalty, and your best performance, and she gives you a slice of the empire's opulence. It's transactional. It's theatrical. It's efficient. And sometimes, just sometimes, it's real. One evening, you find her sitting alone at her writing desk, quill in hand, eyes heavy. There's a letter she won't send. Maybe it's for Potemkin. Maybe for one of the younger favorites who aged out of the rotation but never really left her heart. Her empire stretches across continents. Her armies are undefeated, but in that quiet moment, she's just a woman who dared to want everything and took it. Of course, her enemies spun these affairs into scandal. Foreign ambassadors wrote gleeful dispatches calling her insatiable, immoral, unfit. The British press painted her as a seductress with no shame, forgetting they had kings doing worse. And then came that rumor. You know the one, the horse. Let's just squash it here. No, she did not. It was a fabrication, probably French propaganda, designed to humiliate a woman who dared to rule like a man and love like she didn't care who watched. And still, she got away with it. No abdication, no exile, no dagger in the night. She died peacefully in her bed in 1796, ruler of the largest empire on earth. Her legacy packed with reforms, art, education, and a lot of ex-boyfriends with suspiciously nice estates. You leave the Winter Palace with the sound of her heels still echoing behind you. Catherine was no fool. She knew that in a world ruled by men, being a woman in power meant controlling your image and your lovers. She didn't apologize. She organized. She curated her affairs with the same precision she used to expand her borders. She wasn't great because she was perfect. She was great because she was bold. And because somehow, with a court full of spies and a church full of judgment, she took lover after lover and reigned undisturbed. You're in Stockholm now, but not the prim, IKEA-polished version. This is 17th century Sweden. Snow crackling under your boots, pine trees shivering under the weight of ice, and the streets humming with the kind of tension that always follows a monarch who refuses to act royal. Queen Christina doesn't walk into rooms. She blows the doors off. She's in men's clothes more often than court-approved gowns, quoting Plato while fencing with generals and openly scoffing at the idea of marriage. Tonight, you're in the grand halls of a 17th century Swedish palace, trailing Queen Christina, an 18-year-old who inherited the throne and a life unlike any other royal woman of her time. Raised as a prince by her father's decree, she was schooled in swordplay, philosophy, history, and diplomacy. No embroidery or courtly giggles for her. Fluent in 5 languages, she collected rare books and art, often rejecting the feminine expectations of her era. Her wardrobe leaned towards silk breeches, doublets, and even full armor, drawing whispers from noblemen as she strode past, unfazed. Christina was crafting a kingdom, and herself, into something wholly original. She refused marriage despite pressure from the Pope, the Swedish parliament, and countless suitors, famously stating, "I have no intention of giving up my freedom for the sake of a man." Into this defiant life steps Ebba Speare, her beautiful, devoted handmaiden, always at Christina's side. They shared a bed, exchanged passionate letters, with Christina calling her Belle and signing notes with phrases like, "I love you above all things." These letters brim with intimacy, flirtation, even possessiveness, sparking debate among scholars about whether their bond was physical or purely emotional. Either way, it was no ordinary friendship. Christina once introduced Ebba to a visiting ambassador as her bedfellow, a term that raised eyebrows in the 1600s. When Ebba married a nobleman, arranged by Christina herself, the queen spiraled into melancholy for months, hinting at heartbreak, jealousy, or the loneliness of being too different. Christina pushed boundaries further, rejecting a traditional coronation and dabbling in Catholicism, a bold move in Protestant Sweden. Her court, more university than throne room, buzzed with foreign scholars, artists, plays, debates, and wine, with Ebba ever present, sometimes in the shadows, sometimes closer. Then, in a stunning twist, Christina abdicated, walking away from the crown without war or scandal. She rode off into Europe, cropped her hair, took the name Christopher, and may have dressed as a man during her travels. Arriving in Rome, she converted to Catholicism, shocking the Vatican and ambassadors alike. She thrived, surrounding herself with intellectuals and art, including provocative sculptures that scandalized the pious. Whispers of affairs with women followed her, though some argue her eccentricities simply defied gender and sexual norms. Christina lived on her own terms, never marrying, never bending to kings, popes, or societal rules. In her Roman villa, surrounded by books, paintings, and a faded portrait of Ebba, she died at 72, buried in the Vatican, a queen who renounced her throne and lived unapologetically. Now you're in a Spanish castle, its stone halls lit by narrow slits, where grief and desperation cling to the air. This is the story of Joanna of Castile, known as Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. But her tale is less about madness and more about a love too intense for her world to bear. Daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, Joanna's life was mapped out, a strategic marriage to cement alliances. At 16, she wed Philip the Handsome, a charming, blonde prince whose affection she craved deeply. Their early years were passionate. She bore his children, they danced, but Philip's affairs shattered her. Joanna's emotional outbursts, confronting mistresses and once cutting a lady-in-waiting's hair, were deemed unqueenly. Scholars debate whether her behavior was madness or simply heartbreak magnified by a misogynistic court that expected silent suffering. When Philip died suddenly at 28, Joanna's grief became legendary. She refused to bury him, traveling with his coffin, sleeping beside it, ensuring no woman could see his body. To her, he was still hers, even in death. Her father, Ferdinand, declared her unfit to rule, locking her in a convent for 46 years. Her son, Charles, future Holy Roman Emperor, upheld her confinement. In the cold chapel of Tordesillas, Joanna prayed, sang, and occasionally screamed, not raving but humanly broken. Modern psychologists suggest bipolar disorder or trauma, but historical accounts, written by men who benefited from her removal, muddle the truth. Her love, messy and real, was weaponized against her, her grief labeled madness to secure the crown from male hands. Joanna held onto love, a quiet revolution in a world that punished queens for feeling too much. You're now on a Mediterranean ship, salt air mingling with orange blossoms. Queen Caroline of Brunswick, wife of George IV of England, leans against the railing, her court musician Bartolomeo Pergami nearby, tuning his lute. Their marriage was doomed from the start. George, arrogant and smitten with his mistress, found Caroline eccentric and sharp-tongued. After producing one child, Princess Charlotte, they avoided each other. Caroline, refusing to play the rejected consort, left England for Europe with Pergami, a low-born Italian she swiftly promoted to chamberlain. They lived openly together in an Italian villa, hosting theatrical dinners, writing, and sharing rooms. The British press buzzed with scandal, but Caroline didn't deny the rumors, almost daring the world to judge her. In 1814, she and Pergami toured the Holy Land, dancing in Cairo streets and riding donkeys in Jerusalem, with Caroline insisting he be called Sir Bartolomeo. George, humiliated by her defiance, pushed for divorce through the 1820 Pains and Penalties Bill, accusing her of adultery. The trial, filled with shaky testimonies about shared wine glasses and locked doors, couldn't prove a physical affair, but Caroline's nonchalant defense, neither confirming nor denying intimacy, captivated the public. They rallied for her, chanting her name. Yet, at George's coronation, she was barred from Westminster Abbey, humiliated before a crowd. Weeks later, she died, possibly from exhaustion or poison. Her funeral sparked riots as people fought for her dignity. Caroline lived defiantly, laughing too loud and loving, perhaps too boldly for a royal woman. In Versailles' shadowed corridors, you find Marie Antoinette, not the caricature of excess, but a lonely queen in a loveless marriage to Louis XVI. Wed at 14 to seal an alliance, their marriage remained unconsummated for 7 years, fueling court gossip about her fidelity. Enter Axel von Fersen, a charming Swedish nobleman whose presence sparked something deeper. Their friendship grew into warm, censored letters with phrases like, "I love you madly." Scholars debate whether their bond was emotional or physical, with some suggesting Fersen fathered one of her children. As revolution loomed, he orchestrated their failed escape, the flight to Varennes. When Marie was arrested and later guillotined, Fersen, exiled, wore black for life, never marrying. Their love, whether proven or not, lingers in redacted letters and secret staircases, a quiet defiance against a crumbling monarchy. Finally, you're in a Hawaiian palace, the air thick with plumeria, where Queen Luokalani plays piano, her court musician Charles E. Wilson listening nearby. Born into royalty, she was a composer and poet, ruling during a time when American interests threatened Hawaii's sovereignty. In 1893, U.S.-backed sugar barons overthrew her for trying to restore native voting rights. Before this, she and Charles collaborated on music, including her famous Aloha Oe, a song of romantic longing. Her journals hint at a warm, intimate bond with Charles, though scholars debate whether it was love or mere friendship. Imprisoned after a failed rebellion, she wrote music filled with longing. After Hawaii's annexation in 1898, she lived as a private citizen, her music carrying her grief. Charles faded from records, but in her music room, you sense a connection, perhaps love, perhaps survival, encoded in melodies that outlasted her throne. Darn, didn't like no. You follow their marriage as it descends into paranoia and betrayal. He grows erratic. She grows distant. Then enters James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell. Bothwell was no courtly suitor. He was rough, brutal, magnetic in the way dangerous men often are. Mary's circle didn't trust him. Some feared him, but Mary trusted him enough to turn to him when things with Darnley hit a boiling point. And right around then, Darnley's house explodes. Yes, literally explodes. His body is found in the garden, strangled but otherwise unscathed by fire. Your fringe fact. At the time of Darnley's death, Mary had moved him to a house called Kirk O'Field. One night, just after she left the property, the building blew up. Darnley was found outside, wearing only a nightshirt with no burns. It's almost like someone blew the house up as a distraction and then made it personal. Almost. So, who's the prime suspect? Bothwell, of course. And here's where the scholarly debate sets in, like a slow, smoky fire. Was Mary involved in the murder? Did she know about it? Or was she manipulated, trapped by a man with more ambition than mercy? Historians still argue. Some say she orchestrated the whole thing. Others think she was a pawn in Bothwell's game. What's undeniable is what happens next. Within weeks of Darnley's murder, Bothwell is acquitted suspiciously fast. Then he abducts Mary on the road to Edinburgh. She either consents to or is coerced into marriage, depending on whose version you believe. She's 3 months a widow. The people are outraged. The nobles revolt. Her reputation crumbles like a dry branch. But here's the thing. You can't look away from her. Mary stands in defiance of everyone who demands her submission. She claims love. She claims autonomy. Even as her kingdom spirals into civil war, she has a son, James, by Darnley. Yes, that James who will later unite the thrones of England and Scotland. But at that moment, survival matters more. You walk with her as she's imprisoned by her own lords at Lochleven Castle. She's forced to abdicate. She escapes, rallies an army, loses, and flees across the border into England, where her cousin Elizabeth welcomes her with chains. What follows is 18 years of house arrest in castles, manors, and fortified estates. A queen without a crown, a woman with too many enemies and not enough friends. But even in captivity, she's still Mary. She writes letters to men across Europe, some flirtatious, some political, some both. She charms her guards. She keeps her wits. There are whispers of secret admirers, of hidden meetings, of coded messages folded into embroidery. One of her jailers is said to have fallen in love with her. Did she return the sentiment, or just use him as a pawn? That's up for debate, too. The end comes slow and cruel. After years of surveillance and suspicion, Mary is implicated in the Babington plot, a plan to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the English throne. Whether she knew or merely played the role too well is uncertain. What's clear is that Elizabeth finally signs the execution warrant. You're there in the Great Hall of Fotheringhay Castle on a gray February morning. Mary walks to the block in a velvet gown of blood red beneath her mourning cloak. Like a final act of theatrical defiance, She forgives her executioner. She prays. She dies with dignity. And as her head falls, the legend rises. Even now, centuries later, historians can't agree on who Mary truly was. Tragic pawn, reckless romantic, political mastermind, maybe all three. But one thing is certain. She lived and loved on her own terms. Even when those terms led her straight into scandal, rebellion, and the blade of an axe, you leave her story as the wind howls across the moors again, carrying with it the sound of horses, rebellion, and maybe, just maybe, a whispered name that never made it into the official records. She took lovers, she took risks, and even in death, Mary, Queen of Scots, got away with more than anyone thought she could. You're back in England now. The year is 1525, and the corridors of court are thick with secrets dressed up as etiquette. Everything smells like rose water, ambition, and a little bit of fear. You can almost hear the rustling of silks and the not-so-subtle shuffle of positions being jostled just beneath the surface. And there at the center of it all stands Anne Boleyn, clever, composed, and already writing the most dangerous love story in Tudor history. The queen who isn't queen yet. The girl who caught the king's eye and never let it go, and doesn't enter quietly. She doesn't have to. She's been raised in the courts of the Netherlands and France, where wit and flirtation are weapons, and she's mastered both. When she returns to England, she's not just fashionable, she's magnetic. She's everything Henry VIII's court isn't prepared for. Sharp, unyielding, and maddeningly hard to get. Historical fact. Henry VIII was married to Catherine of Aragon when he began his pursuit of Anne, and unlike so many others before her, and doesn't cave. She refuses to be a mistress, refuses to be just another notch in the royal canopy bed. She plays a much longer game, one where she only accepts a crown, not a compromise. That power move delays Henry's obsession for 7 years. 7 years of poems, promises, letters, and very public frustration. He writes her a series of love notes, calling her my mistress and friend, and promising body and soul devotion. It would be romantic if it weren't also a geopolitical crisis. You're there as the court watches and rise. She replaces Catherine in courtly influence long before she ever wears a crown. Nobles take sides. The church gasps. England begins to fracture under the strain of a king who wants to divorce a Spanish princess and marry the woman who keeps him up at night. It's not just about love, it's about legacies. And Henry is desperate for a male heir. And, it seems, is the only woman who can give him both obsession and the future of the Tudor dynasty. But here's where the whispers start. Because Anne isn't alone in court. She's surrounded by poets, musicians, courtiers, all of whom seem just a little too enamored. One in particular stands out, Thomas Wyatt, a poet with a biting pen and wandering eye. He writes verses about an unreachable woman with dark eyes and a sharp tongue. Everyone knows who he's talking about. Your fringe fact tonight. Wyatt may have been Anne's lover before Henry ever took notice. Some scholars argue their relationship never crossed into physical territory, but the poetry tells a different story. In one sonnet, he speaks of "Nolly me tan hair, do not touch me," a line written about a deer who belongs to Caesar. The implication is clear, and was once his until the king claimed her. Did they ever consummate anything? No one can prove it, but that doesn't stop the rumors from dancing through the court like candlelight on velvet. Even after Anne becomes queen, the court continues to watch her closely. She surrounds herself with young, witty men, musicians like Mark Smeaton, nobles like Henry Norris, Francis Weston, William Brereton, each one with access to her private chambers, each one a little too present. It's hard to tell where flirtation ends and treason begins. That's the problem with Anne. She enjoys the game too much. She thrives in the tension. And in a court like Henry's, that's like juggling swords while blindfolded. The scholarly debate still burns centuries later. Did Anne take lovers behind the king's back? Or was she a victim of courtly manipulation and Henry's spiraling paranoia? In 1536, just 3 years after finally becoming queen, she's arrested on charges of adultery, incest, and treason. 5 men are accused of sleeping with her, including her own brother, George Boleyn. It's a charge so outrageous it seems absurd, but absurdity doesn't save you, and the king wants a new wife and a cleaner legacy. You walk with him through the Tower of London now, her feet soft on the cold stone, her eyes dry and unblinking. She denies every accusation, and there's no real evidence. Only confessions extracted under torture and gossip turned into official record. Still, the trials move fast. The verdict is inevitable. The scaffold waits. She meets her death with eerie calm. She wears a gray gown, holds her head high, and even forgives the executioner. Her final words are whispered, humble, and strategically gracious. Because even in death, and knows how to manage a stage. And here's the twist. After her execution, nearly all the charges collapse under scrutiny. The timelines don't match. The witnesses contradict themselves. Wyatt is never charged. Historians today largely agree that, and was framed, her downfall orchestrated by those who hated her influence or simply wanted her gone so Henry could move on. But in the space between facts and speculation, something lingers. And was flirtatious, brilliant, politically daring. Maybe she didn't take lovers. Maybe she just made everyone believe she could. And in a world where a woman's virtue was her leash, that might have been her most subversive act. You leave her tomb at the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, tucked inside the tower. There's no grand monument, no statue, just her name etched in history and whispered with either awe or accusation. She may have died young, betrayed by the very man who moved heaven and Rome to marry her. But in Bullen didn't vanish. She haunted the throne. Her daughter Elizabeth would one day rule England with all the fire and cunning her mother once dared to wield. And, whether she crossed the line or just flirted with it, took power in a world that punished women for daring to shine too brightly. And for a moment, she got away with it. You're gliding down a polished marble. You're in the lush jungles of Madagascar, where Queen Ranavalona strides through her realm, her robes of red and gold heavy with authority, a ceremonial blade at her side. Reinaharo, a trusted general, rides 10 paces behind, his gaze steady, protective, and unspoken. Scholars debate their bond. Some argue Ranavalona remained celibate after her husband's death, a testament to divine dedication. Others point to Reinaharo's swift rise, titles, lands, his family elevated, as evidence of something deeper, perhaps emotional, perhaps more. Her tomb, built early, includes a second chamber connected by a narrow passage, with Reinaharo's name etched subtly nearby, an unusual choice for solitary royal burials. Ranavalona's reign was fierce. She executed thousands, rebels, colonizers, missionaries, for threatening Madagascar's sovereignty. To her, tradition was non-negotiable, European influence a betrayal. Reinaharo stood by her through it all, guarding not just her life, but something intangible, fragile. In quiet moments, when drums faded and advisors left, her gaze softened toward him, a rare vulnerability. She died in 1861 at 83, still reigning. A new queen, open to European influence, took over. Reinaharo vanished from records, his lands reclaimed, his name erased. Some say he was buried secretly near her tomb. Others claim he fled to the hills, heartbroken. Ranavalona ruled unapologetically, outliving assassins and colonizers. If she loved Reinaharo, seeing her as a woman beyond the crown, that secret was hers, carried through a reign of ritual, violence, and defiance. In the Scottish Highlands, you walk the misty paths of Balmoral Castle, Queen Victoria's private retreat. Here, away from Buckingham's stifling etiquette, she found solace with John Brown, a blunt Scottish gillie. After Prince Albert's death in 1861, Victoria's mourning isolated her, worrying the monarchy. Brown, plain-spoken and brash, became her confidant, traveling with her, dining privately, and calling her woman in his thick Scots accent. She signed letters, "Your loving Victoria." Rumors swirled of a secret marriage, fueled by a sealed letter referencing our bond before God. Her son, Edward VII, despised Brown, calling him Mama's lover. Scholars debate whether their bond was emotional or romantic, citing Victoria's journals and Edward's destruction of Brown's correspondence after his death in 1883. At Balmoral, Victoria laughed with Brown, a sound rare since Albert's passing. He shunned titles, avoided court pageantry, yet gossip branded him a manipulator. Victoria promoted him, gave him rooms in every residence, and mourned him privately after his death, keeping his lock of hair and a ring. When she died in 1901, she was buried with Brown's items, photograph, hair, ring, hidden in her hand. Edward erased much of Brown's legacy, but Victoria's devotion to him, a man who saw her grief and humanity, was a quiet rebellion against an empire's expectations. In 1870s Athens, you enter the royal palace where Queen Olga of Greece, a Russian-born Orthodox consort, writes careful, urgent letters. Married at 16 to King George I, a Danish prince, their union was diplomatic, his infidelities casual. Olga, respected for her charity and translations of Greek texts, found warmth with Captain Mikhail Theotokis, a naval officer with Russian ties. Their familiarity grew, escorting her on trips, sharing private moments, prompting whispers. Missing letters from the 1880s, later partially recovered, hint at intimacy. Your last letter gave me strength. Olga attended naval events, intervened for his promotion, and sent her physician when he fell ill, despite court disapproval. Scholars debate whether their bond was emotional or more, but her locket, bearing a naval officer's portrait, buried with her after George's 1913 assassination, suggests a private defiance. Olga's love, if it was that, lived in glances and gardens, a rebellion too subtle for scandal. On the Hungarian plains, Empress Elizabeth of Austria, known as Sisi, rides recklessly, her laughter defying the Habsburg court's stifling formality. Married at 16 to Emperor Franz Joseph, she chafed under court protocol and her mother-in-law's control, who raised her children. Hungary became her refuge, its people embracing her as a symbol of freedom. There, she met Count Gyula Andrássy, a dashing, ambitious Hungarian pushing for autonomy. Their connection, marked by private rides and meetings, sparked rumors of a perfumed glove sent with a poem. Scholars debate whether their bond was romantic or an emotional lifeline, as their letters were destroyed or sealed. Sisi's Hungarian retreats, her bracelet from Andrássy, and their unspoken understandings suggest more than diplomacy. Franz Joseph tolerated her absences, and when Andrássy faded from politics, Sisi spiraled into solitude. In 1898, an anarchist stabbed her in Geneva. Her journals and a hidden letter signed, "Yours always, G," hint at a love that outran history's constraints. In a war-torn Dutch palace in the 1940s, Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands, exiled in London, broadcast defiance against Nazi occupation. Her marriage to Duke Henry was cold, political, and strained by his infidelity. During the war, Captain D, a Dutch intelligence officer, became her shadow, sharing meals and private talks. A maid's letter recalls Wilhelmina's gentle mirth after a garden walk with him, possibly holding hands. Scholars debate whether their bond was romantic, as her image demanded stoicism. The captain vanished from records in 1944, perhaps killed or reassigned. Wilhelmina's memoirs mention a trusted soul who steadied her, and she kept a worn cigarette case from a Dutch officer until her death in 1962. Her love, if it existed, was a wartime reprieve, too precious for public display. In mid-20th century Tehran, Soraya Esfandiari Bakhtiari, Iran's radiant queen, married Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi in 1951. Their fairy tale wedding belied the pressure for an heir. Declared infertile in 1958, Soraya was divorced and exiled. In Europe, she dazzled on red carpets and met Franco Indovini, an Italian film director. Their years together in Rome, scripts, wine, tangled mornings, freed her from royal armor. Letters reveal her vulnerability. You see me, not the crown. Scholars agree they were lovers, but debate the depth of their bond. Franco's death in a 1972 plane crash shattered her. Soraya lived quietly, her Paris apartment holding Polaroids of their Amalfi days and a rose pressed in poetry. She died in 2001, her will requesting a poem, "I loved the sky more than the throne." She lived beyond scandal, trading palaces for love's fleeting freedom. In Tehran's fading palaces of the late 1970s, Empress Farah Pahlavi, the Shah's third wife, stood as a beacon of elegance. Married in 1959, she bore a son, securing her place, but she was more than a consort. Crowned Shabanu in 1967, she championed culture, education, and women's rights, building museums and supporting artists. As revolution loomed, her grace held firm, but her private silences hinted at complexities. Her story, less about scandal than resilience, reflects a love for her nation that endured beyond the throne's collapse. She was a co-ruler in spirit, if not in title. Her opinions carried weight in political and social reform. Her portrait hung beside the Shah's. But behind the pageantry, the marriage began to shift. The Shah was aging, his health declining, his circle growing tighter and more paranoid. Political unrest bubbled up. Farah found herself navigating a crumbling monarchy, a husband increasingly isolated, and a nation ready to burn everything down just to feel free again. And somewhere in all of that, perhaps in those quiet moments between flights, between funerals, between protests, was a man whose name history never quite pinned down. Here's your fringe fact. In the late 70s, whispers swirled through diplomatic channels and royal gossip columns, alike about a European gentleman who had grown unusually close to the Empress during her time abroad. He was said to be an advisor of sorts on cultural matters, supposedly, but he traveled with her often, spotted beside her in Rome, in Paris at private exhibitions. Never introduced formally, never acknowledged in public statements, but always there. The scholarly debate is quiet here, out of respect or fear. No one could agree. Some claim he was nothing more than a family friend, a fellow intellectual, a harmless confidant in a time of chaos. Others argue the body language in certain photographs, the notes scribbled in the margins of her travel journals, and the fact that this man seemed to vanish completely after the revolution all point to something more. You're with her now in exile after the monarchy's collapse. The Shah and Empress are shuffled from country to country, no nation willing to host them for long. They live out of suitcases, endure diplomatic slights, and watch from afar as Iran redefines itself without them. The Shah grows weaker. Farah grows quieter. When he dies in Egypt in 1980, she becomes a widow in exile, stateless, titleless, but still regal. And then, for the first time, she's alone. It's here that things become even more private. Farah moves between France and the U.S., living in quiet corners far from the royal stage. She writes a memoir, gives interviews, supports Iranian artists and authors, but never remarries, never speaks of romance again. Her children grow up scattered across continents. Tragedy strikes. Her youngest daughter, Layla, dies in 2001 of suicide, and her youngest son, Ali Reza, takes his life in 2011. The grief is unimaginable. Through it all, Farah remains composed. But every now and then, you hear a note of something else in her voice. A flicker of warmth when speaking of old friends, a half-smile when asked about her time in Paris, her fondness for poetry and paintings that focus on longing, on stillness, on absence. One painting in her home, framed in ornate gold, is titled La Disparition. The artist is unnamed. The subject, a woman turned away from the viewer, standing at a window waiting. When asked about it, Farah only said, "It reminds me of a place that never had a name." You walk with her through a garden now in the south of France. The light is soft. The lavender blooms sway gently in the breeze. She moves slowly but not delicately, still straight-backed, still elegant. There's no security detail, no photographers, just a woman with too many memories and just enough silence to protect them. She never confirms the rumors, never feeds them, but she also never denies them. Maybe because she never had to. Maybe because some love stories are meant to stay where they began, in the quiet. She got away with it because there was nothing to get caught in, no affair, no scandal, just possibility. She held her dignity like a shield and buried her secrets where no one could dig, beneath legacy, loss, and the soft hush of exile. And if someone once called her name in the dark and made her feel for a moment not like an empress, but just Farah, woman, wife, soul, well, that was her treasure to keep. You're in a different kind of palace now. One without marble, without thrones, without oil paintings of long-dead ancestors staring down in judgment. This one's all sharp edges and smooth white walls, soft linen, and carefully curated silence. You're in Tokyo, late 20th century, and the empress sits cross-legged on a tatami mat, head slightly bowed, a ceramic tea bowl cradled in her hands. This is Michiko Shota, the first commoner to become Empress of Japan. And her story is quiet but not empty. Because even here in the strictest of palaces, where rules are etched deeper than emotions, there are whispers that one woman, once upon a time, loved someone she never married and never cues she was born into privilege, but not royalty. Her family owned a successful flower company. She was educated at the best schools, even studied literature and languages at university. She was brilliant, composed, and strikingly modern for 1950s Japan. And when Crown Prince Akihito met her on a tennis court in 1957, yes, really, it sent the nation into a frenzy. Not because she was dazzling, she was, or well-educated, she was that too, but because she wasn't from the aristocracy. The imperial household hadn't married a commoner in, 1,300 years. Historical fact: Michiko's courtship with Akihito sparked public fascination and deep imperial anxiety. Newspapers fawned over her style and intellect. Traditionalists fumed. Some members of the imperial family reportedly wept at the idea of a non-aristocrat becoming future empress. But the match proceeded, and in 1959, she married into the chrysanthemum throne. What came next was decades of public smiles and private claustrophobia. The imperial household agency dictated every aspect of her life. What she wore, what she said, where she walked, even how she mothered her children. She was monitored, critiqued, and pushed to the brink. Yet forgot. She was born into privilege, but not royalty. Her family owned a successful flower company. She was educated at the best schools, even studied literature and languages at university. She was brilliant, composed, and strikingly modern for 1950s Japan. And when Crown Prince Akihito met her on a tennis court in 1957, yes, really, it sent the nation into a frenzy. Not because she was dazzling, she was, or well-educated, she was that too, but because she wasn't from the aristocracy. The imperial household hadn't married a commoner in, 1,300 years. Historical fact: Michiko's courtship with Akihito sparked public fascination and deep imperial anxiety. Newspapers fawned over her style and intellect. Traditionalists fumed. Some members of the imperial family reportedly wept at the idea of a non-aristocrat becoming future empress. But the match proceeded, and in 1959, she married into the chrysanthemum throne. What came next was decades of public smiles and private claustrophobia. The imperial household agency dictated every aspect of her life. What she wore, what she said, where she walked, even how she mothered her children. She was monitored, critiqued, and pushed to the brink. She reportedly suffered multiple nervous breakdowns and at one point lost her voice completely for several months. Publicly, this was blamed on exhaustion. Privately, it was understood she was being crushed under the weight of unrelenting formality. And yet, here's your fringe fact. Just before she met Akihito, Michiko had been writing letters to someone, a pen pal of sorts, though that term doesn't do it justice. The man was never publicly identified, but several of her university friends recalled a classmate from her literature circle who exchanged poetry with her for over a year. His letters were quoted in whispers, gentle, layered with metaphor. Lines like, "Even a mountain wind cannot scatter what is rooted in silence." Michiko reportedly carried one of his poems in her diary, well into her marriage. The scholarly debate, naturally, is divided. Was this youthful flirtation or a genuine romantic connection? Could a future empress have had a love affair? Emotional, maybe intellectual, possibly even physical, before her engagement? Japan's imperial household has never allowed such questions to breathe in the open air. But there are clues if you know where to look. In interviews later in life, carefully scripted ones, Michiko would occasionally quote obscure poets, names few people remembered. But scholars of Japanese modernist literature recognize them. Poems often published in early university journals, one of which featured work from that anonymous male classmate. He was never famous, never published again. He left Tokyo for rural Japan shortly after Michiko's engagement. No one ever traced him directly to her, but in 1968 he wrote a single essay under a pseudonym titled the paper Bird Never Lands. In it, he writes, "There are silences louder than thunder, and farewells spoken only by staying away." The entire piece reads like a goodbye wrapped in shadows. You walk with her now through the palace gardens, carefully manicured and impossibly serene. She walks alone, often did even during her most public years. In old photos, she's always perfectly poised, but her eyes, they carry something else, something unmade, a loneliness so subtle you'd miss it if you weren't paying attention. Akihito adored her by all accounts. He supported her, defended her against the stricter elements of court life, even took steps to modernize the monarchy during his reign. Their marriage survived political pressures, personal trials, and the unrelenting microscope of national expectation. But marriage doesn't always erase the ghosts that came before it, especially the quiet ones. Michiko never gave interviews about her youth, not beyond what the imperial household approved. But in her 70s, she helped publish a small collection of her own translations of poetry. Included among them was a single original verse, unattributed. The snow fell so soft it did not know it was melting until it was gone. That's it. No context, no explanation, just a 3-line memory folded into a book about other people's words. You sit with her now on a wooden bench beneath a cherry tree. She watches the petals drift down like rain. Everything about her is still, her hands, her breath, her past. She doesn't speak of scandal. She doesn't need to. Because for a woman raised in a culture of silence, love didn't need to scream to be real. She got away with it not by breaking the rules, but by folding the rules around herself like origami, delicate, complicated, unfoldable, once bent. And if there was someone once who saw her before the crown and spoke to her in verses instead of orders, then she carried that with her, not as rebellion, but as remembrance. You're walking now through long shadows cast by an empire that never fully died. It just changed names, changed faces, changed capitals. You're in Moscow in the early 1700s, where frost clings to window panes like old regrets, and the scent of birch smoke winds through the corridors of the Kremlin. The halls are colder here, grander, yes, but carved from stone and silence. And seated at the center of it all, beneath a heavy fur cloak and 1,000 unspoken secrets, is Catherine I of Russia, pun. Not the great that comes later, but the first, the forgotten one, the impossible one. A woman who began life as a servant and somehow became empress, lover, ruler. And according to every rule in the book, she should never have gotten away with any of it. She was born Marta Skoronska, likely in modern-day Latvia or Lithuania, to a poor peasant family. Orphaned young, illiterate, and entirely unremarkable to the outside world until fate flung her into the orbit of Peter the Great. First as a servant in his household, then as his mistress, then as something more, not a consort in title, at least not yet, but a force, a stabilizer, the calm in his storm. Historical fact, Peter the Great was volatile, brilliant, terrifying, and completely captivated by Catherine. He met her when she was still serving in the household of a nobleman, and within months, she was living in his household, bearing his children, and accompanying him on military campaigns. When Peter fell into one of his infamous rages, it was Catherine who could bring him back. When his advisors failed, When his generals faltered, she remained quietly indispensable. Peter married her officially in 1712, scandalizing the court by elevating a woman with no noble blood, no education, no pedigree. But he didn't care. He gave her diamonds. He gave her power. He gave her his throne, literally naming her co-ruler in his final years. She became the first woman to rule Imperial Russia in her own name after Peter's death in 1725. But that's the official story. Here's your fringe fact. During Peter's long absences and military campaigns, Catherine was rumored to have developed a particularly close relationship with one of his top field marshals, Alexander Menshikov. He was Peter's childhood friend, trusted advisor, and according to some gossips, a little too trusted by Catherine. Menshikov rose swiftly in the ranks alongside him. He was handsome, charming, and not shy about showing deference to the woman who could command the Tsar's attention and later command the court herself. They were often seen together in private conversation. Their correspondence, some of it surviving, is unusually familiar, playful in tone, and occasionally veers into the vaguely suggestive. "I shall not speak of your beauty," Menshikov once wrote, "nor shall I say what it reminded me of, though it made sleep difficult that night." That's not how most field marshals talk to their empress. Scholarly debate swirls around their closeness. Some insist their bond was purely political, two survivors clinging to each other in a storm of court intrigue. Others believe they were lovers, or at the very least that Menshikov hoped they might be. And Catherine, she never denied him, never distanced herself. Even after Peter's death, when she could have cast him aside, she elevated him even further, naming him regent for her grandson, giving him enormous power, ignoring every warning from her advisors. You see them now on a winter evening, standing on a balcony overlooking the frozen Moskva River. He lights a pipe. She takes it from his hand and inhales. It's not romantic exactly. It's something older, deeper, the kind of intimacy you build in foxholes and midnight war councils. He calls her by her old name, Marta, when no one else can hear. Eventually, of course, the court turned. Menshikov grew too powerful, too confident. After Catherine's death in 1727, he was exiled within a year. His enemies rejoiced. His estates were seized. But Catherine's affection had protected him until the very end. She left behind no diary, no confessional letters, no grand proclamations of love. Only actions, elevations, soft favors dressed in the armor of statecraft. And here's the final twist. Catherine died mysteriously, officially from illness, unofficially from excess, too much power, too much wine, too much trying to rule a court that hated everything about her origins. But even as her health faded, she never relinquished her position. She ruled until the last day. And in her chambers, a painting of Menshikov, not in uniform, but smiling, relaxed, hung behind a velvet curtain, visible only when drawn aside. You walk with her through the final hallway now, the oil lamps flickering low, the frost creeping across the glass. She breathes heavily but steadily. She knows what she's built can't last. They'll erase her, twist her, call her a servant who got lucky. But she knows better. She didn't just love Peter, she learned from him. She outlasted him. And maybe, just maybe, she allowed herself a private rebellion, a second love hidden in plain sight. She got away with it by mastering the one thing court life never expected of her: subtlety. She didn't seduce power, she married it, managed it, and, when no one was looking, she gave just a little of it away to the one man who called her by her real name. So when the snow falls in Moscow, heavy and soft, and the golden domes vanish behind a curtain of white, remember, somewhere under all that cold history was a woman who ruled with her heart wrapped in iron and velvet. And maybe, when no one was watching, she slipped the velvet back just long enough to feel. And now here you are, lying in the dark with your blanket tucked just right and the gentle hum of your thoughts beginning to settle. We've wandered through centuries of power and intrigue across continents and empires, into candlelit bedrooms and secret gardens, into palaces with too many mirrors and hearts with too few safe corners. You've ridden with queens who refused to sit still, who bent tradition into strange origami animals, who loved fiercely, quietly, or not at all, but always on their terms. Some of them ruled from behind curtains. Others faced down enemies from horseback. A few smiled politely through unbearable silences. They weren't always kind. They weren't always wise. But they were alive, fully, complicatedly, quietly defiant in the spaces where history expected stillness. Because love, real, secret, messy, forbidden love, isn't about perfection. It's about rebellion. Not always loud, not always scandalous, but real. And whether it was a eunuch in the harem, a naval officer in a coastal kingdom, a poet in a Japanese dormitory, or a filmmaker behind a Roman camera lens, each of these women reached out just once beyond what they were supposed to want, and they got away with it. Not because they were untouchable, but because they were unwritten. They left us just enough, pearls, poems, glances, portraits, to wonder. And in that wondering, they live on. Maybe not as heroes, maybe not as lovers, but as something better, human, complicated, worth telling stories about at night when the lights are low and the questions don't need answers. So now, let the last of the history melt into dreams. You've traveled far tonight, across dynasties and through locked doors. And if your heart feels a little heavier, a little fuller, that's just the echo of lives lived off the record.